Longer. Graham Phillips and Linda Martin. Each speaker will deliver an 8-minute constructive speech. The first speaker of each team will also get a 4-minute rebuttal speech following these speeches. The points of information will be allowed at the first minute and the last minute.
See is that the solution needs to be something dramatic, it needs to be something immediate, and it needs to be something that people notice. It can't be gradual, it needs to be something that actually affects people. And so what we propose for you today is a model of carbon tax. A model that is going to solve the global warming problem and do it in a way that will influence public behavior in the best manner possible. So what we're going to do is recognize the reality that there are alternatives available. Instead of driving their cars, people can take public transit. And so what we're going to do is tax the people who are actually polluting. So if that happens to be a person driving their car, then since the emissions come from them, it will be a direct tax on them. If a company needs to emit in order to make its products, then there will be a tax per ton on them as well, and the consumers will feel higher prices as a result of this higher tax on the company. And what we're also going to do is make this revenue neutral from the government's perspective. So the businesses are going to have to pay more under this, but none of the money goes back to government coffers. Where the money will go is to reimbursing those in the lower economic classes so that they aren't hurt by this. Because we want the people who feel the pressure to be the people who have enough money to choose alternatives, and the businesses who definitely have the opportunity to take alternatives. And the rest of the money is going to be reinvested in solutions to global warming, in alternative sources. So these could be alternative sources of energy, but they could also be things such as carbon sequestering. And finally, we are going to hit everyone, including heavy industry, because what we saw in Norway was that they failed to hit heavy industry, and as a result, their emissions went up. So we're going to prove this to you through 4 contentions today. I'm going to talk about how taxation is the best way to influence public and economic policy. And I'm also going to tell you about the impact this plan will have. My colleague is going to show why it needs to be Canada that takes this lead. And finally, look at the case studies that prove that this is going to be successful. So let's look at the nature of taxation. Because ultimately the government has a lot of choices on how it wants to influence economic activity. It can outright ban something, or similar to outright banning it, it can set a hard cap on that economic activity and say that no one in the populace is allowed to go above this cap, that the total collective amount of this activity that's done cannot go above this cap. But we'd say that these are illegitimate means. These are means that require too much government micromanaging of the economy. What we need is the government using the best tool it has available, a tool that respects people's civil rights, but also influences them and makes it clear to them that if they want to continue doing something harmful, not only to Canada, but to the world at large, that they're going to have to pay for it. And this sort of thing is carbon tax. Go ahead.
Or move to a country where they don't have to pay this carbon tax.
The international competition point. We'll be discussing largely how this is actually beneficial for Canada, how this makes Canada more competitive, because ultimately Canada needs to be prepared for the future rather than keeping itself stuck in the present. So I'll be dealing with that later in my speech. So both in principle, because it philosophically is better to use measures to influence the public that respect their civil rights as much as possible, and also in practice, because taxation is actually the most proven and effective measure for the government to reduce a certain form of economic activity, we can see that this is a good thing. But this isn't just rhetoric and theory. When we looked at things such as cigarette taxes, both the anti-tobacco lobby and the tobacco companies such as Philip Morris admitted that when you set a tax on cigarettes, that the use of that product went down. It's just common sense, but there's hard evidence backing us up on this as well. That for every 10% increase in tax, there was a 4% reduction in the actual use of the product, which is very significant. So what we can see is that both in principle and in practice, taxation is the best way. It sure beats direct managing such as cap and trade. So let's look at the impacts that this plan will have. Because of course, it will pressure people to choose a better alternative. It will pressure people to choose something that is actually going to be beneficial to the environment and stop global warming from accelerating. And so one of two things is going to happen. Either people are going to conform and choose alternative means, which is great. That's what we want to happen. But even if they don't, then the money that they spend on polluting, because we're putting a carbon tax on it, is going to be reinvested into greener alternatives, which means that over time, these green alternatives are going to become more and more feasible, which means that over time, the likelihood that these people are going to continue polluting is going to decrease. Because ultimately, when people decide whether they're going to take the green option or not, it's them weighing the costs and benefits of both. And what we're doing is making the dirty option more expensive for people than the green option. And what we say is that when people will do that, they will do what they always do and follow their wallets. And when right now their wallets, because it's so expensive to choose or inconvenient to choose greener options, is they're continuing to pollute. But when it becomes cheaper to do the greener thing, when it becomes more economically viable for them due to carbon tax and due to us supporting greener industries, they're actually going to change. Wouldn't you agree?
How can Canada actually reduce global warming, considering it only makes up 2.1% of global carbon dioxide emissions?
Canada is the 7th larger contributor to carbon emissions, and per capita, we have more than the United States. And my colleague is going to show how not only do we contribute to it, but we have to take a lead to set a precedent, and politically Canada has an obligation because this is on our territory. So what is the impact that this plan is going to have? Well, people are going to follow their wallets, and because it's no longer more expensive to follow the green route, but is now actually less expensive, they're going to actually adopt a better system. And this system is actually going to make Canada more competitive, because eventually the world is going to go green. And by moving towards greener alternatives, not only is Canada going to be the first country to adopt greener alternatives, but because we're reinvesting the money in greener alternatives, a lot of the green technology is going to originate from Canada. And so Canada is going to have a leg in not only into the use of green alternatives, but in actually being the businesses around which green alternatives are centered. And so we see things like high-tech, cleaner industries that are going to be developing in Canada. And we'd say this is a good thing, not just because it's good for the environment, but because when the rest of the world starts doing it, and there are a lot of the countries around the world who are moving towards this, that when the rest of the world starts doing this, that we're going to be more competitive because we're going to have been doing it for a longer time. We're going to have become more efficient at it. So in terms of actually remaining competitive on an international stage, unlike side opposition who in their POI took a very short-term naive approach, we're taking a long-term approach that actually says, wait a second, the world is going to go green eventually. So who do we want to be when we go green? Do we want to be one of the early people who adapted or one of the later people who adapted? So what have I told you today? I've told you that taxation, both in terms of respect for civil rights and overall effectiveness, is the best means the government has at regulating economic practices that it wants to reduce. And I've also shown you how the impact of the plan is going to be good, not only for the environment immediately, but also for Canada's economy in the long run. So on this basis, on the fact that there is no viable alternative to carbon tax, that this is the best means we have, and because of what my colleague is going to say, we proudly stand in proposition of this motion. It needs to happen.